Hi everyone, this is Natalie Hunter, author of adult fiction and general weeb, here to talk once more about Isekai. So, I wanted to do a little mini-series of sorts looking at some of the high concept stuff that has been applied to the general in another world thing in light novels and anime. You know, the hacks, the gimmicks, the MILFs, but this time it's with a spider type ideas that writers try to use to create new takes on the general Isekai format. Applying an interesting hook is almost essential now that Isekai has basically become a genre in its own right. And to be honest, all of my own books generally have this kind of high concept thing going on. So I'm always interested in seeing what kinds of takes other people have come up with. But not all ideas are good ideas. Some stuff that actually sounds like it has a lot of potential as a one-line pitch or a 15-word light novel title can actually turn out to be way less interesting when you try to work it into a story. Or it can leave the comedy or drama in the series feeling a bit one note. Then there's the execution, which can make even a really good concept fall flat and give that feeling of missed opportunity. So in this series I'm going to be taking a look at some of the most interesting Isekai concepts in recent years and looking at how much potential the ideas have, what kind of challenges the concepts create for the writers, and then how the series in question handles its concept. Ultimately, whether the execution is good. Just all in my opinion, of course, but I hope it'll be interesting to think about. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the first iconic Isekai concept. So, the first series I want to look at is ReZero. And while ReZero actually has quite a few unique concepts, the one I'm going to be talking about is Subaru's Return by Death. Now, I'm going to be upfront here, ReZero is pretty much my favourite Isekai series. In fact, it's one of my favourite anything series. So this is going to mostly be talking about how author Tappei Nagatsuki has handled the difficulties this particular protagonist ability presents well. So you can expect this to be a lot more positive in tone than my video about the 8th Sun, which is the crappy thing I've been watching instead of ReZero Season 2 because of the delayed release. I have read the ReZero web novel and basically any translated side material I can get my hands on, so I'm a horrible walking mass of spoilers, but for this video I won't be discussing any plot points, events or characters beyond Season 1 of the anime. I will, however, need to talk a little bit about how the story is structured as it progresses, things like how time skips and arc structures are used. So while I'll be keeping that super vague, and I won't tell you anything about what happens to Rem or whatever, if you're the type of person who prefers to avoid knowing anything at all about a season in advance, you might want to give this video a miss. I have this one friend who considers it a spoiler if you tell him like how long a movie is or who did the soundtrack, so I just kind of want to cover my ass here. So, Return by Death then. Let's take a deeper dive into it as a story concept. From a purely conceptual perspective, what we have with ReZero is a protagonist who can return to save points in the story, getting a chance to redo things that went badly and to gather information to help him reach his desired outcome. If we consider this idea outside how it's used in ReZero specifically, it's an easy to understand gaming-inspired concept that actually works as a very strong hook. Before you know anything about ReZero and the way Subaru's power works, you already have questions in mind that the story can reveal answers to. So there are already things to be curious about before the story even begins. Does it hurt him to die? How far back in time can he go? Is it time travel or is he going over to a new parallel world with each reset? Can he prove to people he can do this, or is he going to have to cover up how he knows things about the future? There's already a lot of mystery just around how this power is going to be used in the story. This concept is also one that could be made as light or as dark in tone as the author wants. It could feasibly be a premise for a detective type show, where it's all about gathering clues from different timelines. And if the death part is played less for horror than it is in ReZero, more like us losing a life in a video game, then this could be used more strategically by the protagonist, making it a narrative way to apply a time travel mechanic, kinda like the one we see in the original series of the Life is Strange games. If this ability was applied in a virtual setting where death is lower stakes anyway, it would just be a really powerful cheat ability that would make for another type of story again. Now, Tappei had in mind a very different type of story than any of that, and ReZero's uniqueness among the saturated isekai genre really comes from the way Return by Death, while powerful, is not played off as an awesome OP protagonist ability, actually making you really not see Subaru's isekai adventure as wish fulfillment in the slightest. But his version is not the only way a respawn by death type idea could have been applied. It's that versatility that makes it, to me, a very strong high potential concept. ReZero's hook could be taken and made into something completely different. And so it's the way the writer used the concept that makes it what it is, not just the one single idea on its own. But with a hook with very high potential for drama and intrigue, there are also going to be some ways the premise creates challenges for the writer. So what are the potential biggest pitfalls with using a concept like Return by Death? And how did Tappei deal with them? There are a couple of ways that giving the protagonist the ability to reset events and replay them in order to reach his desired outcome could make the story unworkable, repetitive, or stale. One of the main criticisms of ReZero's first season, which is probably best discussed in Giguk's video on the series, was that because Subaru resets time, it's hard to make his relationships with other characters have any meaningful developments, given most interactions won't stick. This did have the effect of creating a sense of loneliness and frustration around Subaru that I think worked for the early parts of the story. But if there was the sense that for the rest of this series, people Subaru knows really well himself would barely know him at all, and that the breakthrough moments where he improves the relationship with another character wouldn't persist, it would be easy for a lot of things to lose their impact. Now, I do agree that this is a valid criticism of the first season if the scope of the series isn't taken into account, and until I read more of the series, I was also wondering if or how Tappei would make the character relationships of what is a pretty large cast actually work. But he's found several ways to remove this from feeling like a problem. One of the most obvious is simply that it's a long series. What we've seen in the anime so far is basically just the prologue. There are 11 arcs planned, and most of 6 already written in the form of the web novel that is treated as Tappei's first draft for the light novels. Arc 4, which will be covered in Season 2, is also absolutely huge compared to the first 3 arcs covered by Season 1. The web novel is already millions of words long, which, to give you some context, the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy only clocks in at about 500,000 words. ReZero is on the kind of scale of something like A Song of Ice and Fire, although I do actually trust Tappei to finish it. This kind of epic scope and large cast means that taking time to introduce all of the major players is always going to be something an author will need to do anyway. And so by using a concept like Return by Death in a long, complex story, it really isn't so much of a problem that character relationships aren't built fast. We'll be spending a lot of time with the different characters and seeing them behave in different ways toward the protagonist when different conditions are in play, and this creates all sorts of ways to make them deeper and create more mystery around them. Seeing the protagonist get to know the other characters in a simpler story over and over would be monotonous, but the only times this sort of stuff is replayed in later arcs of ReZero, it's with characters that have so much going on with them that, like Subaru, we want to see anything that might help us get to the bottom of them. But just because a story has a lot of arcs and words, that doesn't immediately get rid of the problem that the main character is going back in time all the time. A lot of words and a lot of events could have been devoted to what might just be Subaru redoing the same month over and over again, in which case that issue of developments not persisting and the only character with any development being Subaru would still be there. Tappei makes sure we know that this won't be the case by establishing early on that the main plot is going to take place over a period of years, even though those early arcs where we do see all of Subaru's relationships being reset to nothing take place over just days. The only time-constrained event we're made aware of in the series is the royal selection, which we know will last 3 years, so it's reasonable to assume the plot of the story is going to cover that 3-year period. We know that by the end of that, no matter how many loops Subaru's been through, key players will have known him for years, and relationships won't therefore have that lack of progression. The long duration of the story from the perspective of people who aren't Subaru means that there are time skips, which Tappei fleshes out through side stories outside of the main arcs, but during which Subaru doesn't die at all. This means that there are periods as long as a whole year in the story where time is progressing for Subaru in the same way it is for everyone else, and all of the things that happen, as well as the relationships that grow, are permanent. This is made possible by 2 other things that Tappei has done with ReZero that help stop Return by Death just from functioning like a gory kind of Groundhog Day. For one, he's put this ability into a story where Subaru isn't in constant danger of death. Return by Death type mechanics used in a story where someone is in a constant state of danger, for For instance, in a battle royale type scenario, would create that issue where it would never be long enough between avoiding one threat and encountering the next likely cause of death for time to be able to move on by much. Subaru, however, is in a complex world where there are plenty of things that could kill him and all kinds of motives he doesn't understand for why, but he's not being constantly hunted or in a relentlessly hostile environment. In some arcs, it actually isn't clear for quite a long time what is actually going to kill Subaru and put him into one of these loops. And so for a lot of the stuff that happens prior to that first death of a loop, it's all there to stay. The other thing he's done is thought carefully about the save point mechanic, making it something that's both mysterious but also plausible in the setting, allowing it to be a source of mystery in itself, and even a source of suspense in some cases where Subaru is worried that if he dies, he'll return to a point too late to save people. He's careful that the point Subaru returns to in each loop makes sense within the rules we know about the series, but also isn't too far back to make the loop boring. Subaru's time constrained quite heavily in a lot of his loops, and this serves the dual purpose of making his challenges seem insurmountable, creating drama and also making sure there's never the sense that he, or we, are going to have time to get bored by having to repeat encounters that aren't going to be especially different just to get the important stuff. Another problem that a return by death style concept could cause for a writer is that it could potentially just make it seem like the character should bail out of every situation the second it starts to go wrong, by committing suicide. It could potentially feel like Subaru could just save scum his way through life, replaying every interaction he has until everything's perfect, which would mean the stakes would feel fairly low for most stuff that happened to him. I've also seen people who don't know the series too well suggest that Subaru should just keep replaying the same day over and over, returning by suicide, and use that method to grind training and become really proficient in magic or fighting. Now, Tappei has addressed both of these challenges in his story. There are always reasons why suicide is not an appealing option for Subaru. Early on, it's simply that he remembers everything about dying each time and is traumatized by it, rather than becoming desensitized to it over time and being more willing to take the pain for a small advantage. Then there's the fact that he isn't sure whether his chances to return are limited, and isn't sure he'll actually come back after each death. Later, other reasons develop, including some situations where dying would have terrible consequences for him and the people he's trying to help, even though he knows he will return. The times Subaru does commit suicide are few, and the result of truly unwinnable situations rather than cheap redos. And Tappei makes it feel like, for Subaru, the save scumming approach is never really on the table, even while it technically is. He also makes it so that grinding the same day to improve his skills won't benefit him in the circumstances he's in, at least not enough to make it worthwhile. Subaru doesn't have the potential to become a strong magic user, at least not via practice. And while he could improve his physical fighting skills, his potential opponents all have supernatural abilities like blessings, authorities, or just not being human. He isn't in bad physical shape at the start of the story, actually, and he does know some kendo, but those things don't help him in the slightest. It's reasonable then that there's no incentive for him to use his time-bending powers to grind out physical or magical training, particularly at the cost of suicide. Subaru can gain new abilities and get stronger in ways that do actually help, but only by engaging with the world and its people, not by putting in the hours by himself. As you can see, while the return by death concept is one that has huge potential, it's also one that comes with a lot of challenges for the author. While it's a concept that could be used in a lot of different types of stories and to achieve different effects, it does mean that a lot of care has to be put into making sure the ability doesn't lower the stakes to nothing and feel too OP, unless that's the feel you're going for. It's also something that creates a lot of potential pitfalls in terms of stories becoming stale through a repetitive story structure, as well as those issues around things that happen not always being permanent. By looking at how Tappei's cleverly addressed all of these challenges that came with ReZero's concept, it's easy to see just how well crafted his story is, so far at least. And I think any of you who are anime-only fans of the series are going to see and appreciate so much of this stuff when Season 2 finally comes out in July. In conclusion then, as an isekai concept, ReZero is one that has both strong potential and great execution so far. As I make more of these, we'll see how the concepts of other isekai series compare. that's about all from me for this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, please give it a like and please subscribe. This is a brand new channel, so I need the love. If you're interested, you can of course also check out my own Isekai harem books on Amazon, though I have to warn you that most of them are not safe for work and for adults only. Link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again next time.